Thank you so much for coming today. I'm Allie, Brandenburger. I'm co-founder and CEO of TheBridge. We're hosting the event today with Microsoft, who graciously is hosting us. And Fred could not make it today, but we have Tom, who is CVP of Customer Trust and Security at Microsoft. And so he's going to give a couple of welcome remarks, and then we'll start the panel.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. An important event today, an important panel. As we know, election security is absolutely fundamental to our democracy, and we know it's under attack from well-resourced and agile adversaries. And that's why this couldn't be a more timely panel. Time is short before the 2020 election. It's great that we're having, it's kind of noteworthy we're having this panel today on election day around the United States for many, many state and local elections. But we know that the next presidential election and national election is going to be a key focus for our adversaries. And we must do what we can to ensure the security of our electoral system and the trust and confidence that our citizens have in the electoral process. To the extent, and I know that's going to be explored today about possible legislative solutions, what we need to be sure is that we are enabling our voting officials around the country to deploy in a very agile way the security that they need to ensure the security of their systems. And there are impediments to that today. We can address those impediments, but agility is critical because our adversaries are agile and they will respond to whatever we do, so we need to make sure that our voting systems and our voting officials have the ability to respond in an equally agile way. And so to the extent that there is legislation, it should not prescribe particular technology solutions or particular voting solutions, but it should empower our voting officials to adopt the systems and the technology that is the most secure and that they can ensure remains secure so that their voters have complete confidence in the elections in the United States. So thank you for coming, thank you for participating, thanks to the panel. This is going to be a great discussion, I'm sure, and thanks very much for coming.
Thank you for stopping by. For everybody in the back, if there are a couple of seats up here, if you wouldn't mind coming and filling in. I know nobody ever wants to sit in the front row, but all right, well, if you want to, come on up. All right, so as I said, I'm Allie Brandenburger, co-founder and CEO of TheBridge. Thank you guys so much for being here. At TheBridge, we're really working to build collaboration between tech, policy, and politics and build an understanding of the cultures in each. And so election security, cybersecurity is a great venue for us to do this with Microsoft and tech companies generally, but also today we'll be talking about legislation on the Hill and also just kind of what to expect in the next year because the elections are 1 year out. So I'm Allie, this is Ginny. Ginny works at Microsoft, and we have Liz with the Brennan Center and Dan with Lincoln. So I'm gonna let them each kind of just explain a little bit about the perspective they're bringing today and their full title.
Thanks, Allie. Ginny Badanes, I'm the Director of Strategic Projects on the Defending Democracy program. Tom Burt is my big boss. We're very fortunate to have him here in town today. I'm glad he was able to address you all. Tom and our President Brad have really shown leadership when it comes to what is tech's role in election security. It's something that we think is not a solution that only one entity can drive. It's not just a government solution. It is not just for academics and civil society to talk about. We think that the tech industry has a really important role to play when it comes to ensuring security of our democratic institutions broadly and specifically as we're discussing today around elections. So I look forward to talking today about both legislation in the states as well as what's happening on the Hill, and also get into all sorts of other issues around election security, maybe as it pertains to technology, Microsoft's role in that. Look forward to your questions when we get to the Q&A portion. But that's the approach that we take when we're thinking about election security.
Hi, thank you, Allie. Thank you, Microsoft, for hosting this event. It's so nice to be here today. My name is Liz Howard. I'm the former Deputy Commissioner of Elections in Virginia, and I was there in 2016 and 2017, and it is definitely, we have come light years from where we were on an election security standpoint to today. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan, non-policy think tank. One of our main areas of focus is democracy, and election security has a big role to play. And we've been involved with election security issues for over a decade. So I am delighted to be here today. In my role, we work a lot directly with the states on implementing and piloting various election security measures, including risk limiting audits. And we also work a lot at the federal level to promote common sense legislation and additional funding to the states for election security.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Dan Lips. Thank you to Microsoft and TheBridge for hosting this panel and for inviting me to participate. I'm the Director of Cyber and National Security Policy at the Lincoln Network, which is a nonprofit organization that's focused on connecting technologists, innovators, and policymakers to create a more secure, more free, and more prosperous future. And we view election security and institutions generally as key to creating that future. My background is largely in working on Capitol Hill, the former policy director of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, most recently working as for Chairman Ron Johnson on the majority staff.
Great, thanks so much. I think quickly, if we could just do, I think in the audience today we have a bunch of people from the Hill. We also have a bunch of people from the tech scene who aren't as familiar with policy. So Dan, I think quickly it'd be great if you could just give a quick overview of like what we're seeing right now on the Hill. What's the state of play with election security as it comes to federal legislation?
As I was thinking about how to describe what the political environment on Capitol Hill was before today's event, the word that I think best describes it is challenging. It's a challenging political environment for any issue, particularly a politically charged issue like election security. My background working on the committee staff in the Senate, we were always looking to find areas of agreement and bipartisan support to move any legislation. And for that reason, I think we're unlikely to see any of the major election security bills that have been proposed, both the SAFE Act and Senator Klobuchar's bill in the Senate, move forward given the lack of bipartisan support. That said, I think we are likely to see agreement on additional funding whenever we see a budget deal passed, which could be in a couple weeks, could be next year, but we will see more funding. And I also think there's a real opportunity to move narrower, more focused bills that have bipartisan support. There's a number of them that happy to discuss. So there is opportunity to make progress. It's just not as broad as may be wished by some in the group today.
So I think there's a ton of focus in DC on federal legislation, but Liz, I'd be curious to hear, like just hearing Dan's kind of description of the climate here, what's the impact on the states that you're seeing and kind of, is there an impact or like, will that really not make a big difference in the states?
I think the states assume that it's business as usual, which is basically dysfunctional here at the federal level. And so several of them have taken positive steps forward on the election security front. But just kind of looking a broad overview at where we stand across the country, there are 8 states that we estimate are going to continue to use paperless voting machines in 2020, and these are widely identified as machines that are not where we want to be and should not be used in any election, and certainly not in a very important election in 2020. We also have only 24 states that are going to conduct audits prior to certification in 2020, where they will look at the paper ballots. There are some states that that are not included in that number because they continue to use paperless DREs in some counties. So those are a couple of different metrics that we look at. But states are making positive improvements. So in 2016, we had 16 states that were, or 14 states rather, that were using paperless DREs. So for instance, in Virginia, we decertified all of the paperless DREs, all of the paperless voting equipment, and are now using only paper-based voting machines. We've recently seen South Carolina and Georgia transition over to all paper-based voting equipment across the state. And you've also got, Maryland had an issue where there was a vendor that was helping host their a lot of their voter information, their voter registration database, and some of their lookup tools online that was subsequently purchased by a company that had affiliations with a Russian oligarch that had ties to Putin. In response to that, at the state level, they have now passed legislation which is going to require disclosure of ownership and control of the various election vendors. And then we have other states such as Ohio, where the Secretary of State has issued various election security directives and are requiring counties to come up to somewhat of a minimum cybersecurity standard across the state.
So, I mean, it's great that there's been a lot of, I guess, productive work done since 2016, the midterms going to 2020. One question I have just in the States is, we have a bunch more resources now and directives, as you were talking about in Ohio, but what's the impact on a state when there are tons of resources being thrown their way and maybe a lot of money or not enough money, but making the decisions on which vendors to choose or which resources to use? Is that something that you're seeing as like an overwhelming problem in the states, or not really? They're welcoming any help that they can get?
I mean, I think definitely the states.
Turn the mic on.
My apologies. So the states are currently working through how to use their portion of the $380 million that Congress just allocated in 2018. We estimate that approximately 85% of that money will be spent prior to the 2020 election. Without a commitment from Congress that there will be ongoing funding, the states are having to make some pretty tough choices. I know of some states that have struggled because they wanted to provide, for instance, laptops to their local election officials, but without the commitment for additional funding, they were reluctant to do that because how could they pay for ongoing maintenance for those laptops? And these ongoing costs that are associated with providing some, computers or other assets like that. I think, there are a lot of states that have simply committed the entirety of their portion of the $380 million to big ticket items, such, in those states that continue to use the paperless voting equipment, are using a large majority of that, such as, well, all of it in Louisiana. Will go towards purchasing new voting equipment. I believe in Pennsylvania, they used all of their piece to go to new voting equipment. So when we looked at what the states are doing, we found that states are using their money for 4 main projects. So they're replacing antiquated and paperless voting equipment. They are updating their voter registration database so that they have just really basic security measures such as 2-factor or multi-factor authentication. They're investing in audits. And then one of the important pieces I think that they are doing is investing in programs that provide IT and cyber support to local election officials. It is disheartening to know that there are several local election officials across the country that do not have local IT or cyber support. And so states are working to address that. I say that no state received enough money to fully fund all 4 of those projects.
Yeah, it's a problem. So Ginny, in terms of what Microsoft is doing, obviously you guys are doing a lot of great work in the states nationally. Can you kind of talk a little bit about the relationship or what you're seeing really as a tech company? There's been so much focus on what tech companies are doing to help with election security, but a lot of it may not come down to just exactly what Microsoft's doing. But
Sure. No, I mean, I'll start by saying I agree with Tom when he said this is a timely, conversation. The truth is this is probably a better conversation to have had 6 years ago or 8 years ago. I was looking back through my calendar trying to figure out, what was I doing a year out from the 2016 election. I was at Microsoft at the time, focused on campaign tech, not necessarily security. And I was looking back and we had an event a year out from 2016, and it was focused on what's the new cutting edge cool technologies that everybody is using. And there were like 10 other events like that happening at that same period of time, hosted by all the tech companies. They were getting big audiences. They were great events. I don't think anyone was having events on what are we doing to enable the states to have secure elections. And that's part of where I see tech has an ability and a role here to help amplify these issues and talk about them on a bigger stage. And I wish we had been clued in and paying more attention to that and had a bigger role in that in 2015. Because it's not that those conversations weren't happening. They were just in smaller rooms and they were harder to get people there. It was harder to get attention to it. And it's understandable why, because the threat wasn't as obvious. But we don't have that excuse anymore. The threat's obvious. It's persistent. We say a lot our adversaries are agile, and so we should be as well. And that's a pretty consistent thing that you hear these days, but it's true. As far as what tech is doing beyond just getting more involved and stepping in and saying, how can we help? I see a lot of the tech providers doing a lot of work. Obviously, one thing that we've tried to focus on is where are there gaps that we think we have unique ability to step into. In some cases, it's that we recognize we have resources and technologists, and potentially we have R&D that we can put into a topic that some of the smaller companies who are engaged in this effort can't do. It wouldn't make sense for their business model, but we have the ability to do that. So we're doing things like that. But we're also helping with sort of analyzing the threats, seeing what's coming in, working really hard to communicate with other stakeholders. That includes the government, of course, but others as well, to make sure that we are letting them know when they're being attacked, letting them see what they can do about it. Because that's one sort of big question is, okay, we all know we're under attack. How do we do something? What can we do about it? And a lot of times what you can do is turn on two-factor authentication, So we also realize that we can potentially be a voice working on basic cybersecurity hygiene, and that maybe folks will listen to us when we come in and talk to them about it. We're saying the same things that their local IT director was saying to them, but sometimes it has more impact when we're in there telling them you should really consider a password manager, you should really consider turning on two-factor. So we think that we have a role to play to help the efforts that are really being done by the states and a lot of folks on the local level. We're just trying to do what we can to amplify those.
How receptive are people? I mean, I think being in this sphere and knowing about the challenges and implications of not having two-factor, for example, or simple things like that, as we were talking about, are people receptive and understanding that, like versus midterms? Is there a big change or not really?
Well, from our perspective, we deal with a lot of skepticism, which is fair. What are you really trying to get out of this?
Right.
What is Microsoft really doing here? And where is the sales pitch at the end? I'm very fortunate that I sit on a team that doesn't have quotas. We're not doing sales, so we're very lucky that we're able to go in and say, no, really, we're here to help. And ultimately for us, we do want to build trust, and we think that we have a role to play and we have an obligation. And so there's something in it for us, I suppose. But for the most part, it's not what a lot of people anticipate. So we deal with a lot of skepticism. But for the most part, if we're engaged on a very specific project, people are open and willing to listen to what we have to say.
Yeah. Kind of overall question, but we're talking a lot about tactics and legislation that's happening and funding. What do you guys see as kind of like the measure of effectiveness, I guess? Or like what is your, goal for the elections in 2020, just in your own mind, in terms of what you would where you hope to be at, I guess?
I mean, something simple, something that's easy to measure and easy to see is what I've already talked about, right? Like whether or not states are using only paper-based voting systems, right? And whether they're doing a post-election audit that is going to provide confirmation.
Oh,
sorry. So two things, right? Like whether the states are using only paper-based voting equipment, and whether the states are conducting a post-election audit prior to certification, where auditors are looking at the actual paper ballots.
I'd agree with that. I think also, kind of zooming out a bit, it's important for us to keep in my mind, the goal being public confidence. I hope a year from now, whatever happens in the next election, that we can all look back and think that there's no questions about the integrity of the election. I think when you look at the recent Senate Intelligence Committee bipartisan report on kind of the goals of the adversaries in this in 2016 and beyond was to create public distrust, to move us apart, and to undermine our collective nation. So I think that the broad goal should be public confidence.
A couple things I'm really just amplifying that has already been said. When we talk about funding, Liz said it, but she said it kind of quickly. So in case y'all didn't hear. it's great, first of all, that the Senate is agreeing to put some additional funding out there to the states. That's really important. But what I think most of us agree the next real step is some kind of consistent, sustainable funding for budgeting purposes so that the states can do something other than buy some big ticket item because that's the only time they know that they have that income coming in. That's also feels like there's some low-hanging fruit here from a bipartisan standpoint that people can agree to. They can agree that some kind of post-election audit makes a lot of sense. They can agree that you should have systems that have some sort of paper backup. And we can agree that we should have some kind of additional funding to the states where they can take care of some of these other needs that are going by the wayside because they have to spend it on what they have right in front of them, their most important need. I don't think any of that's going to get accomplished by 2020. So to your question of what can we see done, I think it's starting to chart the path towards that, and then ensuring that we actually have an election that has voter confidence that people feel good about. I think those are the goals and objectives, but this is a longer game than just 2020.
Yeah, I think it's also a cultural shift in terms of thinking about, like, there's so many different stakeholders in this conversation, which kind of leads to my next question about, I mean, obviously this is just a panel of 4, so we can't have every single person represented, but from states to federal to voting election officials to the people that are working at the voting booth, like, there are just campaigns and then campaign staff, and there are just so many different stakeholders, and I think a huge one is the voter themselves and being, one, educated about what they're reading, but also, are you registered? Are you registered correctly? Like, kind of focusing and being educated yourself, not to put so much onus on that, but in terms of stakeholders, I mean, one of the big priorities for TheBridge is bringing conversations that are happening in siloed environments together, so where we can bring different stakeholders. So I think we've kind of done that here today, but kind of wondering if there are any stakeholders that you all feel like are left out of the conversation that should be included more, or like folks that maybe the federal officials aren't paying as much attention to, or like that facet of the voting structure, and maybe there isn't, but just curious.
From my perspective, an area where we've made some good headway over the past 4 years has been developing and strengthening the relationships between the federal government and state stakeholders. I recall being on a phone call with former DHS Secretary Jay Johnson back in the summer of 2016, and the idea of DHS injecting itself into the election system was controversial and not always welcome from the states. And I think it's been encouraging to see that relationship evolve. And I know that both government and the private sector coming together is a really welcome thing.
Yeah, I would just say that there has been, like you said, a huge shift. Not too long ago, election security, when election officials talked about it, meant mostly who has the key to the cage that kept the voting machines in the basement of the courthouse. And so this has been a very quick transformation at the federal level and at the state level. I think I don't know that DHS knew who to call in Virginia about elections because we have a slightly different setup than other states. The Secretary of the Commonwealth is appointed by the governor, and the Secretary isn't the chief election official. Actually, the Commissioner of Elections is the chief election official in Virginia. So just building those relationships with DHS from the election officials has really been a positive impact. It never would have occurred to me to call DHS in Virginia if we had issues, when we had issues.
Interesting.
It can be hard sometimes to get the real local election administrators' perspective, just because we do have such decentralized elections. That's one thing that I know we strive to do, but it is very hard to scale to the point where you have relationships across all 50 states with all of the counties, with all the election officials. So I wouldn't say that that's a voice that's missing, because I do think that there are pathways for those voices to make their way up through their states and then to be communicated. But as many events as I've been to on this topic in DC and elsewhere, it's pretty rare to have a true local election official on a panel speaking. It's something I'd like to see more of, but even I couldn't identify someone to bring here today on election day because the local election officials
on
are
election
working.
day.
And so that's a challenge too, is to make sure that all those voices are being represented and that we're not sort of doing a top-down approach to how these elections are being run.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it. speaking of politics, in terms of going into this next year, I mean, clearly it's election year, but how much do you guys think, I mean, we talked about legislation and these relationships that are starting now in a politically charged year. How much do you think that's going to impact progress that could be made? Or like now it seems like we're maybe on a good track, but do you think that that will kind of stall in the next year or not really?
Well, if you don't mind me kind of adding onto the question and directing it, there's been a lot of state activity at the state level. Are there additional efforts at the state level, you think, to pass legislation? Does it feel like that's the path forward with Congress essentially not being able to move forward on this?
I mean, I think clearly that we are lacking in leadership on the election security issue. I mean, you will hear federal officials say over and over again, election security is national security. I don't know of any other national security issue that are left to state and local officials. So I think really an important piece of this is going to be some substantive federal legislation that at least sets a floor for minimum cybersecurity standards. But that said, like Ginny is suggesting, right, I am very hopeful about the positive steps that so many states are taking. And there is a lot of room to improve at the state level, and there's hope that they will.
So quickly on that, in terms of having a federal law across all the states, I mean, we've been talking a lot about how different each state is, and it is crazy, even from a voter's perspective, of just how different each state is and how they conduct elections, where you can vote, timing. From a state perspective, I guess, putting your hat back on, in Virginia, were you supportive of a federal bill, or would you rather states be able to do it how it works for them in the resources they have and what they've already kind of constructed?
I mean, I think that we were very focused on what was going on in Virginia. We weren't necessarily concerned that the federal government was going to take action. So we were focused on what we could do at the state level.
But now, maybe when you're at Brennan Center, I guess my question would be like, do you think that states now, for example, you were talking before about how different states have allocated the money in different ways. Some are out, some are not. Some have used it for tech, some have used it for more educational purposes. If we then go into a system where they're all kind of the same, but yet they're all so different and unique in each county too, would it be helpful to have that kind of overarching bill, or would it be?
I think it would be exceptionally helpful. And as Dan said, I think that there is a lot of room at the federal level where there is bipartisan support. I think there is widespread agreement that we need to have a paper trail for every vote cast. I don't know of anyone that opposes audits. Of course, the devil's going to be in the details, but I think that the federal government and Congress can absolutely establish just some clear minimums. And then you will always have states that can add on to that. But again, right, like I don't think that there's much or any disagreement about, whether or not there should be a paper trail.
I view the current opportunity on Capitol Hill to be finding areas where there's agreement, and I don't think that a national standard there's that agreement yet. I think that on areas where there's voluntary cybersecurity assistance for state and local authorities, there's real opportunity, and there's some promising bipartisan bills that have been introduced in the committee where I used to work in the Senate that I think could move forward in the next year. There's been some interesting bills introduced to try and deter election interference, a bill that would block people from immigrating to the United States if they're deemed to have interfered. There's also sanction bills. Both of those have bipartisan support. You could see some movement around those, but on the broader legislation that would create a national standard, I just don't think we're there yet. It's really important to remember that to move any legislation through the Senate, you need either 60 votes or more often unanimous consent. And that requires a process where you have to pull all the stakeholders together. Everyone has to eat some compromise that they don't like to find common ground. And in this area, we've made great progress, but I don't think we're there yet on some of these more challenging topics.
And likely not in the presidential year.
Oh, and with the calendar really short next year, the politics are ugly.
One area that's not actually federal legislation, but is at the federal level that is showing some movement, in fact, some recent promise, is the EAC's voluntary voter VVSG, voluntary voter system guidelines. Thank you. I should know that. the VVSG 2.0. So if you're not entrenched in this stuff and don't know what that means, it's essentially there is a federal standard that is voluntary that the EAC sets for the states for certifying their voting system. So in most states, this just means the actual machines, if there's a machine involved that you vote on or the scanner that you scan on. In some states, the states themselves will have certification around other things like poll books, but typically not at the federal level. But the standards that are currently being used for these machines, the ones that most people are actually certifying against were from like 2005. And those are very old. And those standards, since this question may come up, just so you know, those standards actually predate the existence of Windows 7. And we get asked about Windows 7. I'm happy to talk about it if there's interest. But the reality is these machines are actually, or these standards by the machines are being measured against were actually set prior to that. They were really a reaction to what happened in 2000 in Florida. And they don't allow for a lot of things that are needed from a security standpoint, for sure, but also from usability and others. And so the good news is that there is a new standard that is being worked on and has recently seems to be speeding up in the process, because for a while it was going quite slow. It seems to be going a lot faster. So there is the possibility for some progress. That's outside of Congress itself. That being said, Congress could fund the EAC substantially more. They're operating at a pretty low budget. They're being asked to do quite a lot, and it's really hard for them to do everything they're being asked to do at the current budget that they're dealing with. So that's something that Congress could act on that I hope would, in theory, be fairly bipartisan.
Cool. So speaking of Windows 7, no, I'm just kidding. Speaking of, all of you guys submitted questions when you RSVP'd, so I know what a bunch of those are, and we'll definitely get to your questions, so keep thinking about them, and then we'll pass the mic around probably in about 5 minutes. But one question I had, just in terms of general tech companies and obviously having the ability to scale and build new products that people can, like in a lot of circles, there are conversations about mobile voting and blockchain and, that sort of stuff. But in terms of protecting customer privacy and security, voter privacy, security, is there like a tough balance to find there from tech companies, or do you think it's just like knowing both worlds is more of the balance?
Well, I would say it's hard for big tech companies to get into the voting process itself. It's not actually a very big market. There's not a lot of profit in it to begin with. So I think that's actually the first trade-off, is where's the business model in this? We're, as I'm sure as many of you know, we've built a software development kit called Election Guard that we've made available for free on GitHub. And it really goes to that core issue of voter confidence. What it allows is, when implemented, it allows a voter to see that their vote made it all the way through to the end of the process, all the way into that final tally. They can go online and check. They don't get to see and confirm who they voted for, but they can see that the vote that they cast, that they had confidence in, that had a paper ballot backup, actually made it into the final tally. And really what that is going at is that voter confidence piece. Like, how do you help ensure a voter feel good that their vote made it all the way through? From a privacy standpoint, there are trade-offs, because that would be a lot easier to do if your vote wasn't private.
Right.
You could secure a vote really easily if you didn't have to also make it private. But we are strong believers in the private ballot, and so for that reason, it's not quite so easy, which is why you get into some of these solutions that are more complex. In our case, it's using a sophisticated kind of encryption. We know others are experimenting with blockchain, so there are other solutions out there, but it's because of that trade-off with the privacy. It makes it very difficult to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think voter confidence is huge, just because I think also there's so many. I mean, a big stakeholder that we haven't talked about is the press. I think there are a bunch of reporters here today, but I think voter confidence comes from what they read, also from if they were able to know when they voted and see that that was their ballot, then maybe they wouldn't be so concerned about a story they read later that said something that was about their district or something. But in terms of kind of building voter confidence, are there any other measures? I mean, Election Guard is great. What else are you guys seeing that's being done to kind of bolster that?
You go.
So, I mean, I think part of what is bolstering people's confidence in the elections is this kind of public discussion about election security, right? And election officials being forthright about the challenges that they're facing and what they're doing to mitigate the risks that we're all facing. And so I think, you'll probably see that in the news today. I mean, it is election day. I'm sure no election is perfect, so I'm sure that there will be issues. Based on what I've seen previously, the election officials are much more willing to be open about what happened and what they did to fix it than they have been in the past. And I think that that's definitely having a positive impact on voter confidence.
I would just add to that it's one of the big factors that affect public confidence is this other side of the coin that we haven't really talked about, which is misinformation, active measures. And in some respects, I think that the progress that has been made on the physical election security over the past 3 to 4 years is way far ahead of what we've seen in terms of countering disinformation. And there's a lot of work to be done there, and that's really important to this overall picture of public confidence.
What, from your guys' perspective, when you're hearing more of these public conversations about election security, what is one of your biggest, what do you think is one of the biggest misconceptions about election security heading into this election? Things that either you read or you hear from folks who maybe aren't living in this bubble of the room that we're in today.
I was going to say, this might not apply to the people who came to an event on election security. Odds are you're paying attention, but the conflation.
But all you guys can talk about it.
Yes, no. But I was just saying the conflation that happens a lot between what actually happened in 2016. I even hear people that I really would think would know better say things like, well, of course, our election voting machines got hacked in 2016. It's like, hold up. That's not what the reports told us. Excuse me. That's not exactly, you're not alluding to what you think you're alluding to is the voter registration systems. And trying to explain to people the difference of what actually we heard from the different reports of what happened in 2016 versus what people heard out of that, what they walked away thinking. Ultimately, it almost doesn't matter because the point is going to the voter trust issue. They hear there was interference. It concerns them. Maybe the details aren't as relevant. I don't know. But I think for me, the biggest thing I hear is just the conflation between what actually happened and some of the solutions people are rolling out to try and solve for other problems, and they're not necessarily one and the same.
I would just say, and again, this may not apply to this room, but the amount of progress that we've made since 2016 when, we first kind of all learned about the efforts to interfere with our elections from foreign adversaries, and all the work that the election officials at the federal, state, and local level have done to further strengthen their systems.
I agree that the big issue is the combination of these ideas of election security and misinformation. Ahead of next year's election, it would be really important for us to not overhype the threat. This is a message that DHS CISA Director Chris Krebs has been leading on. It's important to acknowledge where the threat is and to be mindful of that, but let's not play into the adversary's hands in really overemphasizing what's happening.
One other thing I'd add is, it's not necessarily to the question you asked, but I think we also, just as humans, have a tendency to try and solve for yesterday's problem. And so one thing that we try and do a lot of is, yes, acknowledging what's happened, how do we fix the things that have occurred, but also anticipating what's next. One thing I appreciate that CISA Director Krebs has been talking about is this threat of ransomware against voter registration databases. And in part, I think what it's really doing is reminding people we don't know what the playbook looks like in 2020, so let's not all assume that everything that was done in 2016 is just going to be repeated. Maybe new adversaries, maybe on steroids. It's more than that. The actual practices might change, and so let's be creative and thoughtful in anticipating what the next threat might look like and plan ahead for that as well.
What do you think are the biggest threats to look out for heading into 2020?
I mean, the ransomware one is a legitimate concern because we've actually seen that at the state and local level, not necessarily related to elections, but it doesn't. If you're able to take down an entire city, that's going to impact elections. That's incorporated in it. So this is a practice we've seen a lot of just recently. So there's good reason, I think, to worry about the disruption that would cause to an election.
I mean, I would say this. To the extent, as Ginny indicated, it is impossible to predict what the next big threat is. So what a lot of election officials and DHS and we at Brennan are working on focusing on is building resiliency. There is never going to be a system that is perfectly secure in perpetuity. Maybe you could get something that's secure today, but it won't be tomorrow because of the evolving threat landscape. So, I mean, just simple things such as having a paper backup that you can go back and check.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. If you're following the cybersecurity news, you've seen that over the past few months, a number of school districts have been shut down for the first few days of school back in September due to ransomware attacks. You've seen major cities and municipalities across the country be affected by that type of threat. So that's certainly one to be cognizant of. But I agree absolutely that it may be something we haven't thought about.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that people are talking about a lot is if people don't go to the polls because they think XYZ because they were sent something, or they think that power's out, or that their booth is shut down because of a fake threat, which is super interesting. One question that you guys sent in, and then we'll go to Q&A, so start thinking about your questions. But I know that we have some folks in the audience who aren't necessarily policy focused and more technical. And someone asked if they are a developer, just an average developer, what can they do to help in the elections? Like where can they plug in? I thought that was a cool question.
So my answer is probably not what you think when I said I have an answer for that. The answer is be a poll worker.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't, not to take away from the skill set of a developer, because that's really important, and I think there is a lot that can be contributed to. It's probably hard to just jump in on a project on the side and make a lot of impact, but where you can absolutely have a lot of impact is to volunteer in your own backyard and be a poll worker. I think we need more and more volunteers. And if I didn't happen to always be working on something related to elections on election day, I would really like to do that myself. So I'm going to try and find a time when I can do that too, because as much as I give that advice, I haven't taken it myself. But I think it's really important.
This event will not happen next year.
Okay.
Yeah. What she said.
I'd add to that it's been encouraging to see that this idea of creating a cyber National Guard or cyber resilience guard is becoming popular. It was in the recent Ohio legislation. There's some proposals floating around on the Hill to do that. Cybersecurity generally is something that's going to require all hands on deck for election security and beyond. And so it's good to think about ways to use the resources that we have.
Yeah, I would add too that there are groups too, maybe more in the Bay Area, but that are focused on volunteers that are more technically inclined, that can help and want to be involved civically. So I'm happy to, whoever asked the question, I'm happy to connect you with those groups.
Don't they? They tend to do more with political campaigns.
Yeah. So now we'll go to questions from the audience, and Alex will pass around the mic. If you guys could just say your name and the organization you're from, if you feel comfortable, and then hand the mic back after your question. If anybody has one, I can keep going.
Testing.
Oh, in the back. Not sitting in a chair. Oh, if you don't mind putting in the mic, because the event's being recorded. Even though Liz was remarked.
Thanks so much. This is great. My name is Russell Jackson. I work at Flatiron School. We're a coding boot camp for career-changing adults. Curious about the cybersecurity piece and the mobilization of talent and workforce, and the investment from both federal and local partners to invest in the training of individuals to help with our security.
Good question.
I think there's great interest in that, both at the policy level and at the private sector area. On Capitol Hill, there have been a number of bills over the years that have been moved with bipartisan support, trying to bring cybersecurity talent into DHS. It's a constant request from industry that we need more cybersecurity expertise. It's really neat to learn about the different coding schools and boot camps that are working outside of traditional academia. The estimates are there's millions of cybersecurity jobs that are available. We should be thinking about creative ways to quickly skill up people by expanding new options to get into that promising workforce.
Yeah, I mean, going along with the fellows there's several fellowship opportunities, both in Congress. There's tech fellows. There's the Presidential Innovation Fellows, PIF, that go into the administration and kind of get assignments. So there are ways to plug in. I don't know how many of them directly interface around this topic of like election security. I'm sure there's opportunities for that within those fellowships, and maybe that's something that will be carved out in the future. As a company, Microsoft's very focused on this area. We have a lot of different programs where we work with individuals, especially people coming out of the military who are transitioning into careers outside of the military to work on cybersecurity skills and that sort of thing. But anything directly around election security or local government, I'm not as familiar, but it makes a lot of sense if there were opportunities.
I have one quick follow-up on that. Just in terms, this has been an issue that we've been talking about on the Hill, at least and in cybersecurity community for years now, about the talent gap and the pipeline, and it's a huge space where there's a huge opportunity to get more people involved. What do you think is the biggest issue there, just funding or politics, or in terms of actually having something happen? There are tons of folks like Flatiron School who are asking the same questions.
My view on this is that the biggest challenge is bureaucracy. The Congress has given authority to agencies like DHS to improve their ability to hire and retain cybersecurity talent. But a common issue that's been raised is just the slowness of the bureaucracy and the hiring process, at least in the terms of the federal space. I think it's really a challenge of management and sort of basic nuts and bolts hiring people.
Yeah. I think we have a few more up here. I don't know where Alex is. Oh, there he is. Anybody? We'll try to get as many questions in. We still have about 15 minutes. So.
Hi, my name's Yara Barnoon. I'm with the Tech Law Security Program at WCL at American University. In 2016, I was in Virginia. I was working on the Clinton campaign, wearing two hats on policy, on cybersecurity policy, and then also on voter protection. So some of your trauma is my trauma, I'm with you. So I have two questions. Hopefully they'll be quick. One is on information sharing. So what are the improvements that you've seen in information sharing, and what do you think are the priorities moving forward over this year? And the second is in relation to the private sector and all of the campaign tech, exactly what you were talking about. Microsoft has been doing incredible work on the Defending Democracy program. What do you see as what can you do with the cutting edge tech and getting people looped in and campaigns looped in? I guess it's information sharing again, honestly, but.
Sure. I'll take the second one first. Okay. From the campaign tech standpoint, the biggest challenge is just attention. If you were working on the Clinton campaign, then you know that the focus is getting your candidate elected, and anything that takes away from that goal can often be viewed as a distraction. Not to say that campaigns don't care about security, they do. But when it comes to trying to get them to pay attention to new things, it's a challenge when they're really trying to lock down the nuts and bolts of the campaign. So I think our only issue, if we even have one in that area, would be just getting folks' attention to understand what we're offering, how we can be helpful, how we can plug in. That being said, I would say every campaign that we've dealt with is very focused on security, more so than obviously in previous election cycles, and they're pretty tuned in to what's out there. I hear you on the cutting edge part, but again, going back to what I said before, we still think if we get, and not just at the staff level, if you get senior staff and surrogates to the candidates to take two-factor authentication seriously, that is the most important thing. When we first started trying to figure out how as a company we could help campaigns, we actually started with our own security folks, and we did a little bit of a tour around the company of anyone who had some kind of security in their name, trying to understand what can you offer, what can you bring. It was a little bit of what can we give these guys, or how can we bring something to the campaign space. And most of them were we won't even work with you if you can't confirm that these customers are using two-factor authentication. And we got them to understand the reality of the world, and came together and put together the account guard program, which we think has been really helpful. But the truth is, the place that we started from was they were saying any tools that we can bring are not going to be all that helpful if they're not already doing the fundamentals, if they're not doing password security and deploying some of the most basic cybersecurity hygiene. So that's actually the bigger challenge, is getting them to that place The cutting edge tools are really just going to be on the margins of support. It's all about that, the most important part.
So I would say on the information sharing, similar to several other areas under the election security umbrella, there has been a huge shift since 2016. Things are much better, but there's still a long way to go. So after DHS Secretary designated election infrastructures as critical infrastructure in January of 2017, one of the things that DHS worked to do is to set up the EI-ISAC, so the Election Infrastructure Information Sharing and Analysis Center. So this is an entity that collects and shares threat information. So there's a couple of issues here. First, there are over 8,000 state and local election officials across the country. In order to receive this information, you have to voluntarily sign up. So, and DHS, I think, is doing a great job right now of just, like informing people and educating election officials about this tool. But I think kind of one of the problems that I see with this is, again, back to the concerns about so many local election officials not having IT and cyber support. What is a local election official that doesn't have IT and cyber support going to do if they receive an email that says WannaCry is coming, you should do something?
Yeah. So back, I used to work in the retail industry and in cybersecurity, and we set up the first retail ISAC essentially. And that was the biggest issue: is the inputs need to be something that, like, people have are actionable, but also that people have the ability to digest actionable, and also the voluntary piece. I mean, I think that's where, like, the cultural shift also in terms of two-factor goes back to, in 4 years ago, 2 cycles ago, no one was thinking about two-factor, and now hopefully it'll be something where even your interns and all your door knockers and all of those folks have to have two-factor. But it definitely is crazy how slow that moves when you're in this world, I guess. But I think that kind of goes back to the cultural shift. Okay, I know we have a bunch more.
Sure. I'm David Levine. I'm with the Alliance for Securing Democracy. I guess I have 2 questions. The first one I think will be directed to Liz. I know a lot of us that work in this space have gotten the question, right, ideally with a year to go, replacing critical infrastructure is not optimal, but I think depending on who you talk to, it's doable. And I'd be interested in hearing a bit more, right, for you to tell, I think, folks here about your experience in Virginia, because I think there are a lot of folks that have raised the issue about, right, the ability to do that. And I think that may be illuminating. The second question I have is, a lot of folks, including folks here in the audience, have talked about, right, you having provisional ballots, right, in the event that there are issues, right? But there are a few states that are exempt, that don't offer provisional ballots, right, including my state of Idaho, right? And so the question that I think would then be asked is, in the event of a cyber attack with someone with an electronic poll book, right, what would you suggest, right, recommendations there might be procedurally, including in the form of legislation?
It's so good to see David. He is a former election official in Virginia, so we've worked together a lot over the years. So one of the things that he's talking about has to do with the timetable here, right? We are less than a year away from the 2020 election, and so some of the questions that have come up is, what can election officials do if they just receive additional money now? Can they make substantive improvements to their election infrastructure before 2020? And so absolutely they can, but I will acknowledge this, that the menu of their options shrinks the closer that we get to the election. But a couple of things here. So first off, while I was Deputy Commissioner of Elections in Virginia, in a rather unideal way, we had to decertify paperless voting machines less than 60 days prior to this election 4 years ago. So prior to the election that we were electing a governor, a lieutenant governor, and an AG and state house races, we decertified equipment. So those voter registrars had to completely get rid of, select new, and implement new equipment. And they did it, and they did it successfully. So it is possible, but again, not ideal. And so, even if the timetable for the money is important, but even if it gets really close to the election, we can always do a post-election audit.
Anything on the provisional ballots?
I mean, so David, tell me what you did in Idaho if you didn't provide provisional ballots.
Makes it easier to go. So, no, I think, so in Idaho, and I think this is an interesting question, and I don't, this may be something that loops in there, a few other folks in the room who are on, for example, the Michigan Election Security Commission. All right, Mr. Becker, I know, is across the way here. But I think in Idaho, because they were exempt, right, from the NVRA, they have a same-day registration process. All right, the challenge is that you have an affidavit. So if you actually were registered in Idaho, right, and you had already voted the first time, and then you came back again, and you didn't bring ID, you could do an affidavit. What currently exists, as I understand it, is that if you came up in this context, right, if you did that and we didn't have you, you'd have to go through the same-day registration process, even though you already successfully registered. So if you didn't have the requisite ID, you would still be in a position of having to go through that same-day registration process. So it's imperfect, right? I mean, there was a reason that a few states were exempt from provisional ballots with regards to the NVRA, but didn't cover everything.
So, I mean, it sounds like you have a process that would allow people to vote even if their name doesn't appear on the current voter registration list.
Yes.
Okay.
I think the issue is whether or not, right, based on the status of what you are. Sorry about that. I think the question is, what you should be required to provide, right? For many of the folks that are doing provisional ballots, they're just simply, right, filling out a ballot and getting confirmed afterwards. Whereas in Idaho, you'd have to be providing the ID that you have to provide in conjunction with same-day registration.
Okay, well, so to my knowledge, every state has some sort of, if they don't have provisional ballots, then they have some sort of process that would allow people that believe that they should be and or are registered at that polling location to cast some sort of ballot. But I think that your point brings up something that we do think of in the election security space, which is kind of the number of paper ballots that you order in advance and prepare for on election day, especially in these states such as Michigan, which have recently adopted election day registration. It's going to be perhaps somewhat challenging to predict the turnout. Obviously, we think that election officials need to order sufficient ballots for 100% turnout at minimum. And, we've had election officials, I think our team was talking to the election official in Madison, Wisconsin, and she orders 110 to 120, enough ballots for 110 or 120% turnout because her population includes a lot of college students who may not register prior to the election. So, I think they came really close to running out of ballots in some places, even with ordering enough ballots for 120% turnout. So I think, especially as the states are changing and adopting rules and regulations that make it easier to vote, these are some of the things that we should be thinking about.
All right, it is hitting up on 1 o'clock, so I think we'll take one more question, but know that everybody will also maybe stick around for like 10 minutes, but I know it's the middle of the day, so thank you all for coming and sticking around.
Right. Hi, I'm Jeff Danovich with the OSET Institute. I just had a quick question about the new voting machines that are in place now, today, and in 2020. What are your thoughts on the voter confidence that the new machines will actually count their vote? And one other quick comment as to what Ginny was saying earlier. If anyone's in the Washington, D.C. jurisdiction, I can get you set up with poll worker training if you're interested. Because before I joined OSET, I was a poll worker trainer and the poll worker trainer. So I could set you up with, if you're interested in that, let me know.
Primary or for the general election?
General and primary.
Cool. Great.
I would be interested for your feedback, but I think that voters that go and see the paper record of the vote that they're casting and know that the election officials have that record to go back to in the event that there are any questions, have confidence that their vote is going to be accurately counted.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't know if you were going to add anything. Okay. I want to be really cognizant of time because I know people have meetings to get to, but we will be around until about 1:15, and then Microsoft testifying on the Hill, so we're definitely going to let people go. But thank you all so much for coming. The Bridge is working to have more of these conversations and more of this back and forth, so I'll stick around and I'm happy to talk to anybody. Also, we're at thebridgework.com, so check us out. Thank you so much, and thanks to Microsoft for hosting.
Guys.